In 2004, Dr. Fulvio Cruciani and his team at Sapienza University in Rome analyzed DNA from over 3,400 people across 5 continents. What they were looking for was the origin point of this Y chromosome marker. Where did it come from? Where has it existed the longest? The answer wasn't the Middle East. It wasn't Europe. The highest genetic diversity, which is how scientists measure age, was found in Ethiopia and Somalia, the Horn of Africa. That is where this lineage is oldest. That is where it has been sitting, unchanged, for longer than anywhere else on Earth. And here's what nobody in a popular genetics video has said out loud. The Y chromosome that has been used for over a century to anchor Jewish genetic identity to the Levant, that same chromosome shows its deepest roots 2,000 miles south of the Levant, in East Africa, in a population that has never been centered in that story. If you've ever wondered where you actually come from, not the version in the history book, the real version, the one in your cells, then subscribe right now, because what this data says when you follow it all the way is something no one was supposed to say this clearly. Before we go further, I want to know something. Which part of the world does your father's line trace back to? As far back as you know, a country, a region, a story your family tells. Drop it in the comments, because by the time this video ends, that answer might mean something completely different to you. Named. That word is going to matter more than you think. The migration that carried this Y chromosome northward out of Africa left no cities behind it. No pottery, no temples, no written language. For a long time, archaeologists didn't know where to look because they were looking for the wrong kind of evidence. They were looking for settlements from people who never settled. And when you look for the wrong thing, you find nothing. But finding nothing doesn't mean nothing was there. The DNA is their record, the only one they left. In 2014, Dr. Jason Hodgson's team at Lehman College in New York published a study in PLOS Genetics on the genetic history of the Horn of Africa. What they found was this: the non-African ancestry in Somali populations diverged from all other non-African lineages by at least 23,000 years. That's pre-agricultural. That's before farming existed anywhere on Earth. And crucially, that's a completely different story from what the Y chromosome tells. Because the Somali Y chromosome is even older than that. You have, in one population, 2 different genetic chapters written in 2 completely different geological eras. The paternal line, the Y chromosome, goes back 26,000 years to the Horn of Africa. The genome-wide ancestry carries a later addition, a Eurasian layer from roughly 3,000 years ago. And yet the only story that ever makes it into popular coverage is that Eurasian layer, the recent addition, the newer chapter, the 3,000-year-old room added to a 26,000-year-old house. And yet, the data said the exact opposite of what was being reported. The older story was right there, in the same study, on the same page. Dr. Michael Hammer at the University of Arizona had actually flagged this years earlier. In 2000, his team published research showing that E1B1B was present in roughly 18% of Ashkenazi Jewish men, and they specifically noted that this lineage likely came from North Africa or the Horn of Africa, introduced into the Jewish founding population before the diaspora. That's a directional flag, an arrow pointing south, toward Africa. That flag was not followed. Hold on to that, because in a few minutes, the direction of that arrow is going to reverse, and when it does, everything you've just heard is going to mean something completely different. Because here's the thing. Approximately 1 in 5 Ashkenazi Jewish men carries a Y chromosome whose oldest, most diverse form on Earth is found in Somalia and Ethiopia. Those Somali men are not a distant footnote in this story. They are the story's oldest living chapter. 2 chapters, written by the same hand, in languages that no longer recognize each other. Here's where the genetics and the linguistics collide. And when they collide, they point at the same place. Dr. Christopher Ehret spent decades at UCLA reconstructing the ancestor of a language family that most people have never thought about as a single family. He called it Proto-Afroasiatic, and what it is the common ancestor of languages that are now treated as completely separate. Ancient Hebrew, Arabic, Somali, Amharic, Ancient Egyptian, all of them, the same family tree, the same root. In 1995, Ehret published his reconstruction, over 1,000 root words, phonological patterns, grammatical structures. And where did he conclude this proto-language was spoken? Northeast Africa, specifically the region around the Horn. Migration then carried the Semitic branch northward into the Levant, where it eventually became the language of the ancient Israelites. Stay with me, because this is the moment where linguistics and genomics point at the exact same map coordinate. And that coordinate is not where any textbook puts it. The Y chromosome diversity data says, origin, Horn of Africa, migration northward. The linguistic reconstruction says, origin, Horn of Africa, migration northward. Two completely independent fields of research, same answer. So what this means, when you sit with it, is that the civilization that built its entire identity around being from the Levant, around Levantine roots, around a Middle Eastern origin story, that civilization's founding biology and founding language both trace back to East Africa. They didn't originate in the place they came to define themselves by. They diverged from it. This isn't a story about two populations with a surprising similarity. It's about one population that split, and the two halves went different directions, built different religions, spoke different languages, drew different maps, and then spent 3,000 years defining themselves against each other without knowing they were arguing with a mirror. Now, there was a Somali scholar at Uppsala University in Sweden named Hassan Kanan who was working on exactly this history in the late 1990s, tracing Cushitic genetic and cultural lineage through the Horn of Africa. His work predated several of the Western studies that later received major media attention. His name does not appear in the most cited books on Jewish genetic history. He is not a household name in genetics journalism. He should be. But here's where it gets stranger. The directional evidence, from genetics, from linguistics, converges on Northeast Africa. Both fields reached that conclusion. Both fields had that conclusion available. So what exactly has been happening in the space between the laboratory and what the public was told? That question doesn't have a clean answer, but the next segment has the evidence, complete. That's exactly what the story was allowed to look like. For thousands of years, both Jewish and East African traditions carried a memory of connection. The Queen of Sheba, the Kebra Nagast, the Ethiopian sacred text that traces the lineage of Ethiopian kings back to Solomon. The Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jewish community who maintained Judaic law and practice in the Horn of Africa across centuries of isolation. These traditions were ancient, they were persistent, and for a long time, they were treated as legend. Then in 2010, Dr. Doron Bahar's team, working out of the Rambam Healthcare campus in Israel, published a genome-wide study of Jewish populations. When they analyzed the Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jews, they found something that made headlines. The Beta Israel did not cluster genetically with Levantine Jews. They clustered with other Ethiopian and East African populations. The headline almost everywhere was the same. Ethiopian Jews are genetically different. There are two ways to read that finding. Almost everyone took the first one. Barely anyone followed the second. And the second one is the reason you're still watching. Because think about what that finding actually says. An East African community maintained a religious and cultural framework, deeply Judaic, preserved with extraordinary precision across more than 2,000 years, without the Levantine genetic signature. The cultural memory outlived the genetic migration. The oral and religious record preserved a connection that the genome didn't require. The folk memory was right before the genomic evidence existed to confirm what it was remembering. And then, in 1984 and 1991, in Operations Moses and Solomon, roughly 22,000 Ethiopian Jews were airlifted to Israel. They had survived centuries of isolation. They had kept the practice. They had preserved the identity. And when they arrived, the Israeli rabbinate questioned whether they were truly Jewish, and required many of them to undergo symbolic conversion procedures. The genomic finding that would have answered that question, the shared E1b1b lineage, the Afro-Asiatic linguistic ancestor, the pre-agricultural divergence from a single source, had not yet been published. The people who carried the genetic evidence in their own bodies were being asked to prove a connection their DNA had already confirmed. Think about that for a second. Really think about it. Actually, if you watched my last video on Scythian DNA, you already saw the first corner of this puzzle. The Scythians broke every rule scientists had about where a people came from and how a lineage can travel further than anyone expected. This story does the same thing, but deeper. What did that video change for you? Drop it in the comments, then stay with me, because what's coming next is the part the Scythian video was building toward without knowing it. Because the ancient Bronze Age DNA from the Levant, analyzed by teams at Harvard and other institutions, reveals that the population ancestral to Levantine Jews was itself partially derived from a migration out of Africa in the distant past. Which means that the Middle Eastern Jewish ancestry already contains a layer that, if you trace it far enough, returns to the same Northeast African source. The question of when the lineage became Levantine rather than African cannot be answered, because the transition happened before the categories that would have recorded it even existed. Categories. That is the mechanism. And what genomic data does to a category, when it's actually allowed to, is irreversible. So here is the finding that changes the direction of everything. Dr. Cruciani's 2004 study didn't just locate the haplogroup's origin in the Horn of Africa. It did something more specific than that. It identified the subclades, the branches of the family tree. And what it found was this. The version of E1b1b carried most commonly in Jewish populations, a subclade called EM123, is a derived form. That means it branched off from an older root. The older root is in Somalia and Ethiopia. In genetics, the direction of ancestry runs from derived back to ancestral, from newer back to older, from branch back to trunk. The Jewish E1b1b is a branch. The Somali and Ethiopian E1b1b is closer to the trunk. Everything you've built in the last 4 segments, hold it, because this is where the direction reverses. The Somali men carrying this haplogroup are not distant cousins of the Jewish men who carry it. They are closer to the origin. The Y chromosome that has been cited in academic journals, invoked in diaspora identity politics, used in legal arguments about land and belonging, the chromosome at the center of Jewish genetic identity claims is, by every measurable genomic criterion, an East African lineage that traveled north. The Somali lineage did not branch away from the Jewish lineage. The Jewish lineage branched away from the Somali. The source and the echo have been labeled backwards. And that label has been doing an enormous amount of political and cultural work for a very long time. In 2002, Dr. Mark Thomas at University College London published research using Y chromosome data, including E1b1b frequencies, to argue for Jewish genetic continuity from ancient Israelites to modern Jewish populations. That research was cited in legal contexts related to questions of Jewish identity and belonging. Its directional assumption, Levantine origin, later dispersal, was not challenged on the grounds that the founding haplogroup might predate the Levant. The assumption wasn't examined, it was inherited. And there is one more thing. Several subclades of E1b1b found specifically in Somali populations carry mutations that exist nowhere else on Earth. So localized that they can only have formed in a population that stayed in the Horn of Africa continuously for at least 15,000 years. These aren't traces, these aren't echoes. These men carry biological proof that their ancestors never left. They are the genetic witnesses to the oldest chapter of this story. A story that has been told, in public, without them, for over a century. The question is, what did staying cost? Cost. There is a specific genomic signature for what it costs a population to stay in one place for 15,000 years. It shows up as what scientists call homogeneity, a tight, consistent internal genetic pattern. Less variation, more continuity. The Somali Y chromosome is remarkably consistent precisely because it didn't go anywhere. It stayed. It held. Most genomic studies of Somali populations describe them as a mixture, part East African, part Middle Eastern. You'll see that framing everywhere. It's not wrong, but it's incomplete in a way that matters, because the East African component in Somali genetics is ancient, over 20,000 years old. The Eurasian admixture, the Middle Eastern layer, was added much more recently, about 3,000 years ago. So what you actually have is a 25,000-year-old foundation with a 3,000-year-old addition on top. Calling that a mixture is like describing the Grand Canyon as a combination of ancient rock and a road built along its floor. It's technically accurate, but the framing makes the older thing invisible. What they found next changed the standard description, not the data, the description. And the difference between those two things is the entire argument of this video. Here's something that almost never makes it into the genetics coverage of Somalia. The Somali patrilineal tradition, called Tal, the system of clan genealogy traced exclusively through the father's line, preserves oral memory roughly 40 generations deep. That's about 1,000 years of recorded, spoken history, generation by generation, name by name. And here's the thing. At the point where that oral memory ends, the genetic record begins. The two records connect. They tell the same story, the same directional story. This lineage was here before the categories arrived to name it. But here's where it gets strange. The people who built an entire system of oral genealogical memory around the paternal line, around the exact line that carries the oldest version of this haplogroup, have been consistently described in genetics journalism as a population shaped primarily by migration from elsewhere. The people who stayed are described as though they arrived. A genomic study specifically designed to test the directionality question, to directly measure whether the haplogroup's flow was northward out of Africa or southward into it, is currently in progress. The results have not been published. That study exists. The question has been asked. The answer isn't out yet. Published. And then, for 800 years, nothing. The ancient DNA record from the Horn of Africa goes nearly silent during a specific window. From around 1200 BCE to roughly 400 BCE, 800 years. Here's why that window matters. That is precisely the period when the Israelite kingdom was forming in the Levant, when the texts that would become the Hebrew Bible were being written, when the Cushitic populations of the Horn of Africa were going through their own major internal expansion. Two civilizations, both descended from the same founding lineage, both building their identities during the same centuries, and the genomic record goes quiet in one of them at exactly that moment. The explanation you'll find in academic papers is methodological. The climate of East Africa is harsh on organic material. Bones don't preserve the way they do in Europe or the Levant. Funding for excavation in the Horn has historically been limited. These are real explanations, but they're not the only explanation. And this is the moment where the absence in the record stops being a footnote. The Allen Ancient DNA Resource, the world's largest curated database of ancient human DNA, maintained by Dr. David Reich's lab at Harvard, contains thousands of ancient samples from the Levant, Anatolia, and Europe covering the Bronze Age and Iron Age. Ancient DNA from the Horn of Africa during that same 800-year window is essentially absent from the record. That gap has been acknowledged as a methodological limitation since the database became public in 2018. No published study has formally asked whether the gap itself is evidence. Whether the absence of data during the exact critical window is something that should be treated differently than just a preservation problem. Until this video, that question has not been asked this directly in a public format. The story I'm telling you is incomplete, not because I'm holding anything back, because the record is incomplete. And the record is incomplete during exactly the centuries when the story of both populations was being written. That is not necessarily an accident of preservation, or it might be. And the difference between those two sentences is the most important unanswered question in this entire field. Because what we know is this. On one side of that 800-year gap, you have two populations diverging from a shared source. On the other side, you have two fully formed civilizations, one anchored to the Levant, one rooted in East Africa, that have spent the following 2,500 years with no shared public narrative, no acknowledged genetic kinship, no common story. The gap is where the split happened, and the gap has no ancient DNA in it. Let's talk about what a label does, not metaphorically, concretely. When a Y chromosome marker gets described as Levantine in origin, that description travels. It goes into textbooks, into legal arguments, into identity claims, into the vocabulary of belonging. The word origin in that sentence is doing an enormous amount of work. It's not just a scientific description, it's a boundary, a category, a wall. Now let's say the data, when you actually follow the diversity gradient, shows the lineage is older somewhere else, older in East Africa, older in Somalia and Ethiopia. The data doesn't change the label automatically. The label has a life of its own by then. Harry Oster at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York spent years building what became the most comprehensive genetic study of Jewish identity published in the last 20 years. His 2012 book received prizes, mainstream reviews, academic endorsement. It anchored Jewish genetic continuity firmly in the Levant. It did not discuss the East African origin of E1b1b, the older diversity signal, the directional question. That information existed. It was published. It was available. The Cruciani study had been out for 8 years. Now, I'm not saying that was deliberate. I'm not making that argument. What I am saying is that when a question is not asked, it's not because it wasn't available. It's because it wasn't in the frame. And who sets the frame matters. The Somali men who carry the oldest subclades of this haplogroup, the ones with the localized mutations that exist nowhere else on Earth, they didn't receive any part of that conversation. The genomic record says they are the oldest continuous carriers of a lineage that has been framed as someone else's founding marker. They were not included in the study that generated that framing. They were not cited in the book that popularized it. They were not mentioned in the news articles that spread it. And now here's something to sit with. If your paternal line carries E1b1b, if you are Jewish, Ethiopian, Somali, Eritrean, you are carrying this lineage right now in every cell in your body. The question of which end of the line you're on, the source or the echo, is not a question the chromosome asks. It's a question the label answers, and the label was set before the full data was in. Here is what the science says. 26,000 years ago, one lineage formed in the Horn of Africa. It stayed there, built itself, diversified, created branches. And at some point, probably around 14,000 to 20,000 years ago, a branch moved north, up through the Nile corridor, into the Levant, into the populations that would eventually become the founders of the ancient Israelite civilization. And from there, into diaspora, into Europe, into the genetic profiles of millions of living people who call themselves Jewish. The lineage that stayed, the one in Somalia and Ethiopia, is genetically older, closer to the root, more diverse at the source. Both populations have been here the whole time. One of them has been centered in the story. The other has been described as a footnote to a narrative they genomically precede. There is no villain in this story. There is no conspiracy. What there is a frame that was set early, when the data was partial, and then carried forward after the data had changed. What there is a question that was not asked, not because it was hidden, but because asking it required centering a population that wasn't in the room when the research agenda was set. If you carry this lineage in any direction, you carry something that is 26,000 years old. You carry it from a man in a valley in East Africa who had no idea what he was passing on. He didn't know about diaspora. He didn't know about the Levant. He didn't know about religion or nations or maps. He just had a son. And his son had a son, and the line kept going, both directions. 2 civilizations built out of the same material. One labeled the source, one labeled the echo, and the label, not the DNA, is what determined which story got told. The ancient DNA record goes silent for 800 years at exactly the moment both civilizations were forming. We don't know what happened in that silence. We don't know what contact was made, what was lost, what was deliberately buried, and what simply didn't preserve in the East African soil. What we know is that on the other side of that silence, 2 populations existed, both carrying the same founding marker, and neither was ever publicly told that the other held the older version of what they each believed was theirs alone. That study testing the directionality is still running. Somewhere, right now, a lab has samples. A researcher has data that hasn't been written up yet. An answer is forming that nobody has published. When it lands, and it will land, one of 2 things will happen. Either the directionality confirmed in the diversity data holds, and the story changes permanently, or it doesn't, and we'll need to explain why 2 independent lines of evidence, the genomics and the linguistics, both pointed the same direction and were both wrong. The chromosome doesn't care which civilization claims it. It doesn't know about borders. It doesn't know about 1948 or the 7th century or the Babylonian exile or Operation Solomon. It just carries the record, 26,000 years of it, and the record says the oldest version of this story is still living in the Horn of Africa, still waiting to be told from the right end.